Hi folks, Ed here. In this video I'm going to be giving you my first impressions on the RED Komodo. If you're interested in knowing why I picked up a RED Komodo, then watch the other video that's linked here. But in this video we'll generally just be looking at what I like and what I don't like about the camera after using it after a couple of hours in the field. So when you buy any new expensive piece of equipment, or especially a camera, and you drop a lot of money on it, you want to have that moment where you go, wow, this is the dramatic improvement of what I was using previously. This justifies all the money that I spent on the camera. And with the Komodo, yeah, that did happen. After a week of sort of learning how to use the camera properly and putting it through its paces, then I was like, okay, wow, this camera is absolutely amazing. I love the picture that comes out almost straight away from the camera without having to massage it too much. The image had quite a sort of lovely organic feel to it. It was sharp and detailed, but not overly sharp in the way that I think, a camera like the Panasonic S5 is.
So all of this sample footage was shot at 6K in Red RAW, and it was shot in the lower quality setting at 40 frames a second. Initially I was a little bit concerned by the Komodo's somewhat limited frame rates, the fact that 40 frames is as high as you can go at 6K, but actually I quite like the 40 frames a second. It's really nice for shooting people. I could easily see myself using this in most of my future shoots. With the global shutter on the Komodo, I've just been really pleased with how this camera renders motion, and particularly you can see it here in these train shots. I mean, it's quite subtle, but it doesn't suffer from that artifacting that you would get if this was shot on a rolling shutter camera. And generally in post the footage cleans up really nicely when you're applying stabilization, and again you just don't get any of those artifacts, that sort of jello effect that you get sometimes when you're stabilizing footage shot on a rolling shutter sensor. It just looks a little bit more organic and, dare I say it, cinematic.
It was quite a cloudy and sunny day, so the images were quite contrasty, which I think was a really nice test for it. And being able to see all the detail in those clouds whilst maintaining detail in the rest of the contrasty image was just wonderful. I was smiling a lot as I was looking back at the footage, and this wasn't anything super special. This was just wandering around a seaside town over the weekend. So yeah, I was really happy with that. I was really impressed. So when I took it out on this little trip up to the coast, I had an absolute minimum rig. I had the Sigma Art 18-35 lens, I had the Outrigger handle, and I had two tiny Canon BP batteries to power the thing. I also had the Canon Variable ND EF adapter, which I adapted this lens to the RF mount of the Komodo body. So being able to take what is quite an advanced cinema camera on a little trip, fully rigged, in a tiny old camera rucksack that I had at the back of a cupboard, was just amazing for me. The Komodo has this sort of traffic light exposure thing, so you have three little columns, three little lights which represent the red, green and blue channels of the raw image you're capturing, and when you overexpose or underexpose the image to a point where you're starting to lose information, the traffic lights will light up, indicating either you've overexposed it or beneath if you've underexposed it. And then the more that you overexpose or underexpose a proportion of the image, little bars will then move up or down depending on the proportion of the image that is clipped or underexposed in either of those channels. Once you understand how it works, as a very quick bit of visual feedback on your exposure of the raw image, it is absolutely amazing. I love it. I kind of just want to quickly touch on the use of ISO in this camera. Obviously you're shooting raw. When you adjust ISO, all you're really doing is kind of adjusting a kind of monitoring LUT. So you're previewing what that image would look like with that amount of gain applied, because ISO is basically sensor gain. When you move your ISO in camera, you are doing nothing to adjust the exposure quality of the raw image, and that's really important to know. So what you're seeing is basically the equivalent of what you would see when you bring the raw footage back in post and then you dial in your specific ISO value when you're grading it. So if you shoot at ISO 800, when you pull your footage into Resolve, that will be the default setting that your image displays at. If you change that ISO value in camera, it will not affect the traffic lights at all. You're not affecting the information that is going into the sensor. You're just essentially showing yourself what that image will look like with that additional ISO gain applied. So let's talk about the top screen. I wanted to see how easy it would be to use the camera without a monitor. And my feedback on that is that it's really difficult to use in any sort of bright light. So as soon as I took the camera outside, even in an overcast day, it was really difficult to see the screen. So I would absolutely never recommend using that top screen on a high stakes professional job or any professional jobs, because they should all be high stakes, right? But in a pinch, it probably could get you out of trouble. And what I mean by that is you definitely have to pick up an external monitor to work with this camera. But for whatever reason, if that monitor fell off your camera and into a lake, you would probably just about be able to survive using that top screen. The responsiveness of the touchscreen is, it's not awful, but it's just laggy enough to be annoying. So I hope they fix that in the future firmware update. But just trying to adjust settings quickly is just a little bit too laggy for my liking. So if you're on the fence about this, my recommendation is, if you can afford it, just get it. It's got this really nice sort of rubbery textured grip. It means it's really easy to hold the camera in a single hand. It's easily adjustable with this screw here. And the cherry on top is that it has this record button to trigger record on and off, which none of the other third-party grips have. It just seemed like the most sensible option. I figured if I'm going to be using this camera day in, day out, I want it to be as comfortable to use as possible, and just having that record button on the handle, it doesn't seem like a big deal, but I think stuff like that just really makes life a little bit easier and a bit more comfortable. The hand grip is a really important aspect of the ergonomics of a camera. Now, the weight of the Komodo, I would describe it as being reassuringly heavy. It's not too heavy that it's going to strain your back, but it's heavy enough to have a good heft in your hand and to work with you when you're shooting handheld to help you stabilize shots, and I really like that. Although it is really lightweight, I think I'd still anticipate using it with an easy rig for professional settings, because I think once I did add a monitor and slightly larger vlog batteries and a few other bits and bobs, it is going to pump the weight up a tiny bit. If I was filming across a day or a couple of days in a row, I would definitely, use it alongside an easy rig. The lack of ND filters for me was a bit of a concern before I picked it up. I had ND filters in my previous camera, the Panasonic EVA 1, but when I picked up the Komodo, I also picked up a Canon EF variable ND adapter. But in between the lens and the sensor, inside the adapter, there's basically a variable ND filter, and you just control that with a little dial at the side. And I actually really loved using that. Although the quality of a variable ND filter is not quite up there with standard hard stock ND filters, for a lot of uses I think it's going to be absolutely fine. So I'd heard a lot about this in terms of like boot up times and the black shading, but when I was out and about over the weekend, it was fine. I think it took like 30 seconds to boot up. It's not an issue. I think if you're comparing it to a camera that boots up in 10 seconds, what's 30 seconds? It's not a big deal. And then the other thing was black shading. So the other thing is you've got to black shade the camera every single time you switch it on. In a professional situation, that's probably true. But from what I understand, once you black shade the camera, it is good to go within a certain temperature region. I think that you have about 10 degrees either way or something, don't quote me on that. But in order to monitor and check that, there's a little icon on the camera that allows you to check that the sensor has heated up and is within an optimal operating temperature. So all you have to do, if you have black shaded your camera, as long as you're not going from crazy temperature extremes, you're probably going to be okay. All you have to do is boot the camera on, wait for that little symbol to turn from red to yellow to green, and if it's green, you're good to go. Now, what I found was that if I was shooting outside and it was a tiny bit colder because I black shaded it originally inside, it just took like an extra minute or two to be ready to shoot, and for me that wasn't a problem. And the whole, black shading, black balancing process isn't completely alien to me. I had to do that with my Panasonic EVA 1. If you're moving up from a DSLR, that might take you by surprise, but for me, it's something I've always done anyway. So when I took out the camera for its test, I powered it with two little Canon style BP batteries. I have bought a couple of mini V-Lock batteries which I'll use in professional environments. I had ordered the Tilta Power Advance plate or whatever it's called, but that was out of stock. So I got the whole camera delivered and then I had no way to power it. So I had to pick up two little Canon BP batteries whilst I waited for that plate. I just went and bought the cheapest I could find, the Blueshape, and you know, they're fine, they work. They lasted for the whole weekend. I think there was still quite a bit of power left in the final battery. The great thing about the Komodo is that you have the two batteries in, it drains one and then just moves over to the next one. I wasn't sort of continuously using it for a long time, but it was, you know, it was great that those two batteries were enough for a little trip. The batteries I'd purchased with the Komodo for professional use, I think, are the Mini FX Lion V-Locks, and they're great. I love them, they're tiny and they don't really add much bulk onto the camera. So I think before I bought this camera, working with 6K RAW footage was a little bit of an angst-inducing prospect because I hadn't really worked with a RAW workflow before and I was a little bit intimidated by it. But as soon as I got these files into my editor, they were just really easy to work with, and that goes for both Final Cut 10 and Resolve. So, you know, if you're using Final Cut 10 and you're used to turning around projects quickly, I found it really easy to cut stuff or sequences together really quickly, and it was also really easy to put a fairly basic color grade together. So that really impressed me, that surprised me as well, because I think there's a lot out there that suggests working with raw footage is a very complicated and technical process, and it is, and it can be, but also it doesn't have to be if you don't want it to be. The raw image gives you the flexibility to push it around in post. But if you're wanting a simpler look and you're not massaging the image too much, then that's absolutely possible as well. Now, where the magic really happens is when you pull the footage into a program like Resolve. Resolve just gives you so much more control over how you process that raw footage. Also in Resolve, there's quite a lot of ways of eking out a bit more performance. If your machine is a little bit slower, you can change how it, you know, initially decompresses the raw. You can drop the quality of that. You know, you can do the standard things in Resolve, like drop your playback resolution and also the playback quality. So within those three methods, there's a lot of performance that you can squeeze out if you're worried about dealing with raw images. Or of course you can create proxies to work with as well. In Resolve, I was able to get pretty decent playback performance, you know, even with one or two basic color grading nodes. Once I started stacking stuff and, you know, and putting, you know, noise removal on it or sharpening or anything like that, that's when stuff started to get a bit choppy. But apart from that, yeah, I was really impressed that this raw footage was pretty easy to work with. So at this stage, I obviously haven't tested out the audio, I haven't tested out an external monitor, the SDI, so I'll put out another video later on, but I just wanted to give you my first impressions of using this camera. There's one thing I just want to note before we finish, is that this whole concept of testing equipment out before you put it through professional use, I think is really important. For me, when I got the RED Komodo, there was no chance that I was going to take this camera out and use it for the first time on a professional shoot. There was so much I didn't know about this camera, there was so much I needed to learn in order to make sure I was getting the best image out of it, that using it for around 5 to 10 hours before I'm ready to bring it into a high stakes professional job where clients are breathing down your neck and making all those early mistakes in a non-high stakes environment where I could bring the footage back and go, oh, that looks terrible, what have I done, how do I make it look good? That's really important. That's something I recommend. If you're getting a new camera, get a feel for it and understand how it works. Anyway, that's a bit of a detour. As always, thanks for watching. The next video, I'll be looking at some of the accessories that I bought with this camera, so if you're interested in that, stick around for that. And also in the future, I'll put out another video that just gives a basic intro into working with RED RAW footage. And I'll have a particular focus on that for beginners and people who've never worked with it before. So if you are a bit intimidated by working with RAW footage, I think that will be really useful for you, because I was, you know, intimidated with the prospect of working with that kind of footage. And I'll try and demystify that process to make it more accessible to you. So, as always, if there's any questions, put them down below. But until next time, see ya!